like there's certain signals that indicate like, a company's on fire in a good way. It's like, wow, look at their year over year top line or user base growth. Yeah, they're losing money and they lost more this year than last, but look at the pace of this growth. Like we can map this out and this looks insane. And I think there's some specific things about how mobile and mobile user acquisition works that let you tell really exciting but not necessarily truthful growth stories by ways that you can essentially cook the books by doing, John identified like one tactic, but can for almost any game, if you have infinite money, can you show year over year doubling top line revenue? Almost certainly. um, but does that mean that it's actually being invested wisely and at some point there's going to be profits? Absolutely not. And I think a lot of acquisitions of the last decade were made on just very, very poor understanding of if and when true profitability could ever come.
Hey guys, welcome. Great to see
Hello.
y'all.
Hey.
Howdy.
Yeah, so I thought we could go ahead and just jump right in here, but I really wanted to talk to you guys as the premier experts in gaming and user acquisition and product as well,
Clearly.
Steve. But so there's been a lot of talk about, in terms of like the biggest hot topic, what's happening in gaming. I ran a survey on LinkedIn and turns out that like this fall in user acquisition seems to be the hottest topic, at least for the people who participate in that survey thought to be the biggest topic. Certainly been hearing a lot more anecdotally from a lot of studios where they have been talking about how previously profitable campaigns they've had to scale down or a lot of them have turned negative. And so I posted about that and wanted to like get your impressions as far as like what's going on. And so from your perspective, you guys are actually doing stuff in the industry right now. Where are we right now as far as UA performance on iOS?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I think some of our back and forth when you posted that initiated this podcast, and
Mhm.
I was really surprised to see that. For context at Upptic, not to shill, but like our day to day is essentially running growth marketing for the game studios that we support, and we've been doing way more profitable spend on iOS than Android for the past year or so, and so I was kind of surprised and unsurprised. Like we developed definitely a little different approach, and we can get into that further in. But for our portfolio, if you say, hey, Warren, you can market on iOS or Android right now, but you can only pick one, I'm picking iOS 10 times out of 10. And besides, the main thing there is just like opportunity if you can figure it out. Like one thing I pulled up just before this is just like looking at CPM trends, and it's such a clear depression in CPMs in iOS over this time period as they've like correspondingly increased in Android. So it's easy pickings if you can get a viable strategy, and I think the challenge is just finding that viable strategy.
Right. And John, is that what you're seeing as well, or?
I can't I cannot comment on the performance, but I think what the way that I'm thinking of it is shifting the burden of audience targeting back onto the advertiser. And historically we rely on um, the algorithms of the many advertising platforms to do that for us, right? And so we had the luxury of having, let's say, 6, 7 years of not having to shoulder that burden. All right. What we saw with the IDFA deprecation is all of a sudden everyone's about creatives, right? Creative is now the most important thing. I was like, well, creative has historically been important. You just chose to ignore it because you allow an algorithm to do that work. But if you take a step back for a moment, why are creatives today so important? Well, because creative in many ways allow us to connect to audience personas, right? Essentially audience segmentation. And so we now as an advertiser need to really think about, okay, who are the users that we want to go after? what are the differences between them? Where do these audience live in terms of their engagement and their eyeballs? And what type of content do we need to create for said platforms in order to connect and convert? That is something that is quote unquote new to most UA people today because they haven't had to do it for like 5, 6, 7 years.
So maybe like the lock or the degradation in performance could be that the operator matters, that the person running the campaigns, because now the burden has
Very
shifted
much.
back to them.
Yeah.
So
If you're
that
Warren, you know,
if you're Warren,
it's
you're
gonna
fine.
it's gonna go like this, right?
Yeah, no,
Not necessarily. We'll get back to that. We came from a place of desperation, honestly. But we'll come back to that.
Right. And Warren, when you're talking about CPMs dropping, is it, basically, is that because we're kind of entering this kind of recessionary phase and advertisers are pulling back, and as they pull back, it makes buying for you easier? Is that the implication of that comment that you made?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of interlinked factors, but there's just less competition. There's less buyers.
Right.
The average price of
Right.
CPMs goes down, but definitely a confluence of factors, including the ones you mentioned.
Okay.
The
What's your
targeting
take,
is also
Steve?
broader too,
Oh,
right?
oh,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was gonna say like the targeting is also broader, which also brings down the CPM.
yeah.
okay.
I think everybody's observations are very trenchant. I think what's happened since the deprecation of IDFA is that we put the art back into UA a little bit. In that, yeah, like IDFA deprecation broke our whale finder, right? It's basically what it did. So now, as I think John was saying, we're back to this situation where we don't have algorithms doing all the work for us in quite the same way, in most cases. Couple provisos. I haven't been active in UA for quite a long time, and Pixelberry only has one live game. So I'm not as exposed as Warren at Upptic or John at Scopely to multiple games and multiple strategies. But I think what we've seen is that it's also kind of difficult to disentangle all of the sort of different contextual factors that are in play right now, between IDFA deprecation, the pandemic, and then competition, which fluctuates, in both directions depending on the segment that you're in, right? So all of those factors can militate against each other in really complex ways, and it's difficult to disentangle what's actually going on performance-wise.
And Warren, you seem to be having a lot of good performance, but can you comment in terms of like the specific genres that you're involved in? Are you buying for some of the potentially more difficult genres to buy against, like that would be more whale oriented or whale hunting oriented?
Sure. So currently our portfolio is, I think, 9 or 10 developers and call it like 12 to 14 active titles, the bulk of which is in gaming. The same trend and same tactics have generally worked across the board. To Steve's point, I think that whale-driven games do have a disproportionately harder time right now. Because when you only have and we'll probably unpack this more later on, but if we're just thinking about users that are opting in, which on Facebook or Google might be 10% or 5% depending on the genre and the month that you're looking at. Obviously, if the bulk of revenue is driven from a small subsegment, it's harder to get statistically significant data. So I think the more whale-driven, the more difficult it will be.
The next question I can ask you guys is really around, in Steve, you kind of alluded to this, right? There are multiple factors that are potentially impacting the performance of UA campaigns and games. So we've got IDFA deprecation, which seems to be largely being scapegoated for for bad performance of any kind of UA campaign by game studios, at least anecdotally for me. But we also have the COVID hangover. We've got inflation. What do you guys think kind of moving forward, like if we start getting to a deeper recession, or other factors that game studios should be aware of to be watchful for, and how that could potentially impact UA performance? Any thoughts on that? And again, maybe starting with you, Warren.
Sure. So I think there's two halves of this. There is, as you mentioned, more difficulty achieving profitable growth.
Mhm.
And then simultaneously in the market, we have far less tolerance for unprofitable growth. So far less, far more difficult to raise rounds or to continue operating unprofitable studios. This was not the climate, a few years back. So I think those two factors have really compounded each other and just leading a lot to, we're seeing everything from just like the slashing of marketing budgets to massive layoffs and studio closures. But those are the two meta factors to me.
Okay, John or Steve, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll
Cool.
second that. Like, basically, when you have things going on in the macro economy, rising interest rates, that vacuums up the cash that was sloshing around, right? And that just has follow-on effects, exactly the way that Warren just laid out. I think bankrollers are much less willing to accept the argument that you're going to get paid back in 2 years, right? We just don't see that anymore. I think
Right.
even a year out, right, for payback window is like, do I really want to do that? Depends on the game, depends on the track record, right? But
Yeah,
that's the sense I get.
right. And I agree with you guys, but what would you say to the folks who basically speak about how, for games as the lowest cost form of entertainment, people are just going to continue to spend on games regardless. How do you guys think about that perspective? Or do you think it's situational in some way?
I mean, I'm hugely I'm eternally bullish on games. Like that's basically a plan for the rest of my foreseeable life to be working in that sector in some way or other. I think we just are hitting the tail end of um, it's kind of we're uncovering a lot of toxic elements that I think underpinned aspects of mobile gaming for the last decade, and a lot of that is kind of like coming into clarity, like with time now. So I do think we're seeing like certain types of businesses that are already being filtered out and will continue to do so. But that doesn't kill my
Please
bullishness on
provide
gaming as a
examples.
sector. Oh.
Yeah, Warren, which games are you talking about?
Well, maybe we can just I'll just float one that I don't have any data on, because then maybe we can talk about it equally. But I'm just curious, like this is maybe a hot one, but like the passage of time, what do you guys think of like sort of the perceived growth story of Machine Zone now versus like when we were in the thick of like their heyday?
I mean, they were a UA machine, right?
But it all kind of ended with a whimper, and I'm just curious,
Yeah.
like and I feel like I can speak freely because I have no inside info to this. I'm just curious, like why did we see essentially like the biggest behemoth in the space ultimately go down with such a whimper and just become a subsidiary of AppLovin?
Okay, so I'll tell you guys if we're talking about Game of War, I think that there's like the common theory behind why Game of War fell, and then there's my own theory that I have, and so like the common theory is that they just it was game inflation, so they just ran a bunch of sales and then they inflated the economy. That's the common view that most people talk about. And I think that I actually believe that the bigger problem had to do with the player ecosystem. That in fact, for a time, I do believe that Machine Zone was acquiring players not necessarily to be UA profitable, but to feed the elder players in the game. And so there was like this because it's a game where the strong prey on the weak, and if you run out of targets, then there's not much to do. And so I think that's for that game in particular, it's a much more difficult situation to analyze because we don't have a lot of visibility into the internal dynamics of the game. But I think a lot of the inflation that happened was trying to get early players to be mid-tier players so that the bigger players can feed on those players, for example. So I don't know, like I would find it hard to specifically understand what they were doing from a UA perspective. Were they trying to pump players? Probably. But then, whether the rationale for that was to like feed the elder players or to bring players in for that reason, or for just to try to pump the revenue of the game, I think that's a little more of a difficult. It's difficult to get a specific conclusion on like the motivations behind the UA.
Well,
Does
what
It's
I
that make
hear you
probably
sense,
saying
not
guys?
there,
one thing of good.
I was just going to say super fast. What I hear you saying there, Joseph, to sum down, is essentially unprofitable growth that was powered by a faulty model. Like maybe
But
that model made sense with the data they had
right,
on hand, but
but
ultimately
but
didn't pan out.
I don't know if you can call it like negative LTV if the player economy were able to hold together. Do you know what I'm saying? Because if that elder player it remains happy and stays in the game and continues to spend, maybe it's worth it to bring in these, so that's the tricky part where I wouldn't want to just say, oh, that spend just doesn't make sense. And then there are other factors as well where I believe, and again, I don't know, but just as an outsider looking at that game, it felt, and then seeing some of the launches of some of their games like Crystalborn, I saw patterns where it felt like this was a game being managed in silos, that people were looking only at specific parts of the game and optimizing against specific parts, so that holistically,
Yep.
like Crystalborn felt like a Frankenstein, like things were just kind of slapped together, and people were like kind of designing or making different parts of that game. And I feel like that probably happened on Game of War, where, kind of similar to like a Zynga, where you've got, and again, we're going a little far afield on UA now, but where different people were looking at different parts of the game and optimizing against those different parts, which then, you know, was probably the reason why the player economy or the player balancing in the game kind of fell apart.
I
John, I
think
think you had some. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, just my comment there is it felt like they weren't building for cohesion between like the different things elements
Right.
within game. And yes, this is very much a product conversation now. But if you think about the game, even when we think about how UA ties into the game, I think historically UA and product exist as two different segments of one thing, and that communication is lacking. So to give you an example, if you think about user acquisition, what is the goal of user acquisition, right? Our goal is to showcase a value proposition and make a promise to our users, right? Hey, come install this game and you'll have fun, whatever it may be, in most simple form. And then when you come into the game, if you have a piss poor onboarding, experience, right? You're no longer kind of meeting that expectation that was set by that creative that you did, right? So the idea of building continuity and building cohesion from D0 to D3, D3 to D7, D7 to 14, D30 and beyond, that cohesion and continuity and that kind of thinking is incredibly important. And when I think about Game of War, and I remember like spending a lot of time on Mobile Strike specifically, is that it felt like you're going in one direction, and then all of a sudden, like, boom, you go in a very, very different direction once you hit a specific level, or like if you start paying, like, there's a huge pivoting point, at least from a user experience standpoint, um, which actually ties me back to, UA today, and how that's evolved is that understanding of building continuity, building continued engagement, fulfilling the promises that you make with the ad creative and on that install, and how do we do that well? I think a lot of advertisers today are realizing that and making that shift. Again, going back to the idea of no longer relying on algorithms and shifting the burden of performance back onto the advertisers themselves.
Right. And so is that the new world, John, where UA marketers are not only going to have to like learn how to do UA again, but also be able to work with the product teams and help them or work together to optimize, whether it's the FTUE, the tutorial, or first conversion, early
Yep.
conversion, things of that nature. Is that basically where we are now?
I think so. I mean, like my role changed recently.
Mhm.
So I'm no longer UA. I'm actually growth. And so the mindset is when you think about growth is made up of many different elements, UA being one of them. And so the way that I approach it now is how do we build in-game engagement experiences, or sorry, in-game experiences to engage users and out-of-game experiences, right? And out-of-game can be, that initial ad that you see. Out of game can be a blog. Out of game can be a Discord community, right? It could be a plethora of things. But the idea of like driving continued engagement through and through, creating entertainment value for our users through and through. I think that's kind of the mindset that I'm approaching it now, because we have a tendency in user acquisitions like, oh, I hear like so and so is killing it on influencers. We need to jump on influencers. Or like then a month later, it's like, oh, I hear so and so is like killing it on TikTok. We need to jump on TikTok. And so it becomes this like flavor of the month model of chasing what everyone else is doing. And while that's cool and all, I think our core focus needs to be what is everlasting. Uh, Channels come and go, but content and creating like really great content, and content can exist in the form of an ad creative, and truly understanding your users and understanding that your user base also can evolve, right? Like for my IP specifically in this case is Star Trek. you know uh, CBS or Paramount is doing an incredible job of introducing new content around this IP. But what that means is, when you kind of define the term a Trekkie, that's no longer someone that was born in the 1960s that watched the original series or the Next Generation. Like for me, I'm a post-Kelvin Trekkie, right? Like J.J. Abrams movies, right? And then we have some Gen Z people who know Star Trek from watching Lower Decks or Discovery, right? So as we understand that the audience is also evolving, our content, our creatives, our channels will have to evolve around that. So going back to like the user is driving the evolution, not the flavor of the month type. And I think that's kind of the mindset.
All right. And Steve, from your experience, UA or growth or product, how do you see this evolving, or do you think this will impact you guys as well?
Yeah, no, I think these are great points. Just quickly setting the table for what I now do and what I'm responsible for. I'm head, or I guess you could say general manager of a new platform called Storyloom at Pixelberry. And the fastest way I've found to describe Storyloom for people who know games is that it's Roblox for writers. So we have a platform for creating and then selling interactive fiction, basically. And we're in closed beta. So we haven't thought too much about our growth strategy, but we're really starting to think about it because we'll be opening up later this year and then hopefully hitting our growth stride next year. And I think this idea that there needs to be a growth ecosystem, right, is very trenchant. We're creating a platform. It's cloud-based. So yes, we will have absolutely native clients on the App Store, and we will do, traditional UA, right? We will do that. But it's going to be so much more than that. And it has to be so much more than that. Ultimately, what it needs to be is us helping third parties on the platform market themselves and do our work for us and create viable businesses on the platform, right? That's what I'm now focused on. And, there's this constellation of social media products and blogs and I mean other games even that we can all leverage to facilitate that. We were talking a little bit about Discord before we started the podcast, and like full disclosure, I'm not super familiar with Discord, other than to know that it's a huge deal, and our writer base is very active on it. So I better figure out what's going on with Discord, right? I think these are all the new tools in the, I guess, the growth professionals toolbox these days. It's not just about like, oh, how do I optimize my campaigns on Facebook? That's still important, to be clear. And like a lot of products will live or die on that. But I think that we're moving to a new era of mobile gaming to a certain extent, where we have to get a lot more creative and understand where the customers are and what they want to do. I think that's correct.
Okay.
I think one
And
theme that we're all kind of coalescing around here is growth does not equal UA in the current environment. Both how teams are being structured, or even just like what is the most effective for each game or each project. And something that really opened my eyes just briefly in that end was like going deeper into Web3 ecosystems. Like I'm basically overdosed on Discord at this point. I need like more Discord out of my life. But working with more Web3 communities where like using ads is a horrible lever for driving growth within Web3 because it's a highly skeptical community, highly educated, and it's essentially like for our earlier stage Web3 partners, we just said don't advertise. Like there's more effective growth levers.
got it. And
what are the effective growth levers for Web3? Just out
Yeah,
of curiosity.
I mean, in short,
it's like going to these communities and talking to them, right? More or less.
Essentially, yeah. So, I mean, like not to go too in the weeds, but essentially, social proof is the most valuable, driving factor we found, and the best way we've been able to kind of like productize and replicate that is essentially building like community outreach teams where the Web3 project you represent. You make connections to other communities. You offer them value of some form, such as like hosting a private founder AMA or giving them, free in-game items to raffle off or whitelist spots, and essentially get co-promotion with those communities by bringing their communities value. I mean, it's a very unique state because you really just care about a few thousand people at the end of the day that are likely to be very engaged players with how nascent Web3 gaming is right now. So very different strategies.
Got it. And Warren, I'd like to go to a pretty controversial statement or potentially controversial statement that you commented on my original LinkedIn post. But
Here we go.
Before we get there, I just wanted to close the loop on like this IDFA deprecation stuff. And so like there was another comment that maybe the performance drop that some companies are seeing could be based on, SKAN on how SKAN attributes installs. But I was wondering if, is there an issue around how people are measuring performance, or is a general consensus here that iOS with SKAN is still performing well, at least for most genres, like the well-based genres accepted, and you can generally do okay. Just wanted to close the loop on that. Any thoughts from you guys?
I guess the one thing that I would say is I feel like when SKAN came out, Apple basically like imagine like you're stuck in a prison cell, and SKAN comes out and basically Apple hands us a chisel, and everyone's like, okay, cool, we're stuck in this prison cell. We got handed a chisel, start chiseling our way out. And most of the industry is still just chiseling versus kind of taking a step back and being like, is the door unlocked? Like, is there a key under the mat? And that's kind of like my main advice. Like we basically figured out an approach to just kind of like ignore SKAN. Like I don't think it's a serious solution. And until it becomes so, like we've developed workarounds that essentially ignore it. And I would recommend that people just kind of, rather than continuing to bang their heads against SKAN as the only way to get there, kind of zoom out and look for other ways to work within the ecosystem.
And
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we took a look at SKAN and we were like, okay, that's bad. Obviously, that's going to hurt us. Let's go ahead and escape this ecosystem, right? So now we're web first, and I think a lot of companies will be looking at that. They'll be looking at mobile web. They'll be looking at other solutions where you can still get all the data you want, right? To a certain extent. Maybe that's another way to go. This is unexplored territory. So we're going to explore it and do an end run around whatever the platforms are doing, right? We're trying to build our own platform on the open internet. And of course, to a certain extent, like that's fallacious, right? Like the internet is semi-open platform at best, because you've got whatever Chrome's doing and all the rest of it, right? But nevertheless, it is somewhat underexplored territory. And so maybe we can walk out the door of the escape room, right? As it were.
I think one of the things that I saw with the introduction of SKAN is the most common question that I would hear is like, hey, how are you setting up your conversion events? Because I think this is due to like years of training too within the user acquisition industry where like people are so ingrained to look at performance on a DX ROAS model, right? Like I need one KPI to tell me whether I'm doing a good job or a bad job. And there was this desperation to go back to that with SKAN, right? What is it? Is it cost per purchase? Is it cost per event? Like I need something, a North Star, so to speak. And while yes, that is important, right, to understand to introduce new measurement methodologies for us to measure the performance in a new ecosystem is important. I want to go back to the idea of like, well, there's still that first part. You're talking about how to measure a end result. Why not focus on how you connect as well, right? Um, who are the users? Who are you targeting? How do you want to target them? That dictates everything else. And I still feel like there's this rush of like we need to make better creatives. Well, yes, but there's more to that than just like it's all about creatives. And I think that that mindset is still kind of some companies have done a fabulous job and have adapted and have been able to like really springboard off of like what SKAN brought to the table, and some company I feel like they're still stuck. And I really want to really highlight the fact that that mindset shift needs to happen. Like not everything is going to be last such measurable. Not everything is going to be a DX ROAS measurement models. So like think about like what are some of the different ways to measure. Thinking about who are you targeting, who are your users, truly understand it. Don't come to me and say, oh, my user base is 25 to 40 males, right? That tells me not much. There's a lot of segments within that group. What are they? Define it. And so that's why I say like there's so much more work to be done on the front end that hasn't been done before. And I think that's
Yeah.
worth the time to do it now.
Really traditional sort of qualitative research and persona research is coming back into
No
vogue.
one in UA likes the word qualitative, by the way. I found out,
I know.
or directional, or yeah.
Yeah, directional. Yeah, like we've always called ourselves quantitative marketers, right? And that's still important, but like if you want to do social science, you got to do the quantitative and the qualitative,
Yeah,
right? That's important. You need
maybe we
both
can
sides
talk
of that
about
picture.
it in a bit, but I do feel like I hear more UA people talking about personas more recently. Is that the case with you guys? Are you guys using personas? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're getting a lot more serious
Okay.
around that stuff and trying to understand how to do it well, trying to do,
Right.
assemble
And
panels,
I think,
right?
yeah, I
And
believe
really dig
Zynga
deep.
has a specific practice around personas and how they do UA. I believe.
Yeah, a lot of the larger publishers have effectively research branches, and they employ social scientists, like anthropologists and psychologists and stuff like this, and to try to get better at
All
this.
right. Well, let's get to Warren. If I can read, if you don't mind, I'd like to read your comment here, and maybe you guys can react to it. So, just to set the context for the audience, when I had posted a number of potential hot topics, one of them was a dramatic fall of UA, and Warren, to that you had posted, quote, "I'm curious about dramatic fall of UA and why that's coming up as a common topic." It was the number one topic. One thing I believe we're seeing is a market wisening up to unprofitable financial engineering that was driven by UA in past years. Many companies were acquired based on fake growth stories due to lack of deep understanding of UA by the acquiring party. I think the dirty secret in our industry was that a large percentage of growth stories were knowingly unprofitable and unsustainable, and now larger entities are realizing that they didn't buy what they thought they bought. So, Steve and John, do you guys agree or disagree with this statement?
No comment.
I wholeheartedly agree. and I've been a part of companies where
Warren, were you talking
that was the
about Glue
case.
Mobile?
And
I was not.
Okay, sorry, John. Please continue.
no, it's just is in general, like, yeah, that is the case
Yeah.
in not every company, obviously, but we oftentimes as marketers, when we're doing competitive analysis, like, there's a good gauge as to, like, something looks legit and something looks like that's off. Like, that doesn't make sense, right? There's some situations where, like, why are they spending $2 million a month in Indonesia? Like, what's going on there? Like, it's like did they, like, it's either A, they found out some secret way to monetize the Indonesian player audience, which good for them if they
That's
did.
awesome. Yeah.
That's amazing, right? Like, if you can,
Right.
or something is off, or something more nefarious is happening, and I think that we've seen a lot of examples of that through the
Yeah.
years.
Warren, to what extent is this like an analytics story where during due diligence, the acquirers just didn't pull apart those cohorts and like disaggregate properly and take a look at, what's actually going on. And then they ran into like
Yeah,
cohort death,
I use
you
you
know?
use a key word there, Steve, which is cohorts. And honestly,
Hmm.
part of this is from seeing data, and I'm not going to name names of just like different deals that I've been part of vetting over the years. But part of it is also being, I'm sure you guys have had this too, just being solicited for like consulting calls from the investment world of people that are looking at different deals and just
Hmm.
understanding the gap
All the time.
in the gap in understanding, but specifically when it comes to cohorts. So if we think of just sort of like traditional tech investment and growth stories, like there's certain signals that indicate like a company's on fire in a good way. It's like, wow, look at their year over year top line or user base growth. Yeah, they're losing money and they lost more this year than last, but look at the pace of this growth. Like, we can map this out and this looks insane. And I think there's some specific things about how mobile and mobile user acquisition works that let you tell really exciting but not necessarily truthful growth stories by ways that you can essentially cook the books by doing. John identified like one tactic, but can for almost any game, if you have infinite money, can you show year over year doubling top line revenue? Almost certainly. you know um, but does that mean that it's actually being invested wisely and at some point there's going to be profits? Absolutely not. And I think a lot of acquisitions of the last decade were made on just very, very poor understanding of if and when true profitability could ever come.
And Warren,
Yeah,
oh,
I think
go
that's
ahead.
right. And I think that I was just going to say, like, when I started doing UA a while back, like, I'm fairly quantitative, but even if you are fairly quantitative, like making the switch to cohort based thinking, it's not intuitive. Like, it actually really isn't, and it took me 6 to 12 months, honestly, to like really wrap my head around it, because you need to learn to think in that mode. And I think a lot of investment bankers, like,
Right.
they don't.
And Warren, in terms
Yeah.
of, oh, sorry,
I kind
sorry,
of
maybe
look
I
at
could
it
just ask
like
one
it's
question about the mechanics of how
oh
this works, Warren. So,
yeah.
like,
Mm.
when you are showing that high growth, and you're spending so much money, what is the justification, or how do they justify that? Is it based upon a presumed or forecast ARPU curve, and they're like, yeah, we're buying, but we're going to make this much money back, 2 years from now, or over some very long, kind of payback window or something like that? Is that the mechanics of how that's justified?
Yeah, I mean, the way I've typically seen it index is essentially they show like the growth trend of revenue continuing to increase, but at some point, like
Mhm.
cost efficiencies come in and costs come down, but the growth stays on the same curve. But when the bulk of cost is just on unprofitable ad spend, like that,
Right.
it's built on a false premise that that same growth
Okay, so,
can
so
still
they're
continue.
right. So they're not even drilling down to the the specific detail behind the UA
Right.
in that case. Okay, sorry, John. Please go on. You were saying.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, this conversation reminds me of, in blackjack there's something called martingale, where you double your bet every time you lose.
Oh, right.
And that, yeah, it's kind of like that, right? Like, oh, it's not profitable. Okay, buy more,
You got to win
right?
sometime.
So your top line looks good. Right. Yeah, eventually you'll figure it out, the profitability, right? And I think like we've seen incredibly large companies, right? The supposedly incredibly sophisticated companies do that, right? And sometimes it's the business model, sometimes it's the UA. But one thing you mentioned earlier, Warren, about like, us getting reach out from these like research agencies to have a UA expert to speak on some of the things. I'm like, some of the people you're talking to are the people who are employing these
Mm.
tactics, right? And it's just like kind of bewilders me that like VCs don't have you know a marketer or a kind of like a marketing discipline that can like Steve said, like go in and really break it down by cohort and be like what does this curve actually look like fuck top line. Sorry, I don't know if I could curse. Like screw top line. Like look at like what is the true recoup, what's the payback, what's the kind of like the net LTV of the users
Yeah,
that people are
is
bringing
your
in.
payback window
And
going exponential?
we've been doing this for like 20 years, and yet or at least UA has been around for like 12 years, but like we still are seeing investors falling into these traps, and
A
you're
lot
like,
less
really?
now, though. The
Why?
market has really cooled off. You know. Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
that's more
Yeah.
macroeconomics specific, which hopefully will force investors to build out this discipline. But it's it shouldn't take a major macroeconomic economic shift for people to think along these lines. You should have always, it's like going back to the idea of like we should have always been thinking about creative and personas and understanding our users in UA, but we didn't do it because it was convenient enough for us to not to. Right. And I kind of see it like same thing with like investors. Like you could have always been much better with your due diligence and your vetting of like numbers and analyses. Like don't have bankers do that, have marketers do it. Right. Um, it's always there. It's just it was decided that it was unnecessary because money was cheap.
All right, guys. Well, I thought we could just wrap on this last question. Basically, when we're thinking about the current environment and how UA has changed, or if you're thinking about how UA will likely change in the future, I know Jon, you brought up a few points, but are there, like, if you were to characterize the biggest factors of what we're likely to see in terms of changes, what would you guys say those would be to be, as competitive as possible moving from now and moving into the future? Jon, you want to start since you brought up a few points already?
Um, yeah, I think is going back to what I said earlier is understanding like user acquisition is one of many things
Mhm.
that needs to happen in order to create sustainable growth, sustainable and profitable growth. And uh, how does UA work with all the other elements, whether it's brand marketing, social, PR, product, live ops? Um, that inter-team collaboration is more important now than ever before. I really like Steve's mention earlier about like some companies have full-fledged research teams, and how important to combine and balance the qualitative and the quantitative, right? Every gaming company have a data science team, but does every gaming company have a user research team? I don't think so. Um, why is that important? Well, it is now because algorithms aren't as accurate, but also thinking about the future world of measurement, what that means. There's no longer going to be a single North Star. We might have to be living in a world where we have multiple, depending on what we're doing, and being comfortable with that, and having those definitions set now, and maybe refreshing it regularly is also incredibly important. So this idea of I have a single KPI that I need to aim towards, that's probably gone, and being okay with that and moving forward. I think it's going to enable us to evolve UA. So UA is not dead. It's not the UA apocalypse. I don't see it as a downfall of UA. I see the evolution as the natural evolution of user acquisition.
Okay. And John, just to clarify one of the points that you made in terms of a user research team, what are some of the types of things that they would be looking at?
Continuously feeding data to acquisition team and growth teams to help them understand how the user base is evolving. And then giving a deep understanding of who they are, because that research will enable growth marketers to understand what content they need to create to engage,
Okay.
whether it's new user acquisition, re-engagement, or retargeting. Like that, again, everything should come from who, and that should be defined.
Okay. Steve, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think that's really good specific advice, John. I think my two main things are to reiterate full funnel thinking as being really important. So this notion that it's not marketing and then product, it's got to be both. And I think that's honestly always been the case, but we've been able to get away with not doing it because, the algorithms were so powerful, right? But now we need to look for those sources of efficiency, and that's definitely one of them. Connecting everything through personas is a very powerful way of doing that. And then just the second broad-based factor I would say is just creativity. And I don't mean creativity just in the sense of creative, for ads. It's actually like new strategies, new sources of users, thinking in nonlinear ways and trying new things. I think we're like execution is still very important and it always will be, right? But we're now also in a place where we need to map the contours of the new room that we're in, to use Warren's allegory earlier, and that requires creativity. And in order to have that creative freedom, you need to have a certain amount of support, at the executive level to be able to do that. You need budget, which not every company has. And you need, I think, to a certain extent, enlightened leadership as well. So it needs to be like a full organizational effort, in my opinion.
Got it. Warren, you want to wrap us up? What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to say a few things that the other guy said, but in kind of different framing. We're in an era where you're not going to be able to just optimize your way into profitability. You can't you can't sub-pub optimize as your main lever to get from unprofitable to profitable growth. And I really like to hear John saying that Scopely is taking this more holistic approach to growth. That's definitely how we tried to structure our business as well at Upptic, which is we really position of just you need a kind of full stack growth marketing org. It's not like a problem like UA is a hammer, and that's not the right tool for every situation. So in a lot of our work, our UA spend recommendation for one of our partners is 0, and it may be 0 for a prolonged period of time because it's not the right thing to do. There's a lot of times it's more about getting your house in order. You can spend, double next month, spend this month getting your house in order, having product and marketing working together. It's been a lot more fun too, just working on things like positioning, working on spending more time developing predictive buying models and things like that. So I think coming back to the theme of this podcast of UA apocalypse, UA as a discipline is kind of, I think, off of its throne. The era where the UA practitioner in the traditional sense could be the driving factor of growth, I think that may be behind us. It doesn't mean that those people and the skills, I think all of us come to some degree from that school. It doesn't mean that, those skills are not valuable. They're extremely valuable, but now it's just part of a more complicated holistic growth marketing puzzle.
Right. So UA apocalypse, new era of growth, basically.
Yeah, part of the notion of the apocalypse is also the notion of rebirth, right? So you destroy the old world in this cataclysmic battle, and then you have the opportunity for a new kingdom of purity and profit.
I like it.
Somehow after all that cynicism, we ended with such hope. I love it.
No, it's funny. and I might get skewered for saying this. I think SKAN is probably one of the best things that happened to UA. And yes, from a business point of view, it's bad, right? Like all that like easy profitability is no longer here. But as a discipline, as a marketer, I think it's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
Because it is enabling us to return to what it means to be a marketer. And to be creative, like you said, Steve, to be innovative, to do new things, to be experimental in a way that we have not been for the past 6-7 years. So yeah, yay,
Woo!
SKAN.
Exciting. It also destroyed Facebook and turned it into
Well put.
Meta, which is kind of cool. So there's that too.
I'm sorry, Meta stock.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for your time, insights, and all that. And for our audience, we will catch you
Thank
next
you.
time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.